Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mick Napier, and welcome to another one of our fairly regular Sunday afternoon broadcasts where we speak to individuals who have something valuable to contribute to the conversation about delivering effective solidarity to the Palestinian people, and of course, related issues which can inform that campaigning. I'm delighted today to have Moazzam Begg here speaking from, where are you, Moazzam?
I'm in good old Birmingham.
He's in Broome, where I believe he was born. Moazzam, a big welcome to you. We'll talk to Moazzam in a moment, but we're waiting for Charlotte Cates to join us from Vancouver. But since it's 8 a.m. there on a Sunday morning, Charlotte might be a little bit groggy. So I propose that we'll... Charlotte is the spokesperson for the Samidoun group, who campaign and have long campaigned in solidarity with Palestinian prisoners who, of course, are routinely tortured and abused. Charlotte, if we can hold on a second, Moazzam, I see Charlotte. Charlotte, you ready to join us? Nope, you've got a microphone issue.
That's all. I just have myself muted by default.
I have form in that department as well. And on one occasion, I tried to share an absolutely brilliant idea with the world, but nobody could hear me because my microphone was muted, and then I forgot what the brilliant idea was. Welcome to everyone. So as I say, once again, my name is Mick Napier from Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Moazzam Begg from Birmingham, and we'll hear his dramatic story. And Charlotte Cates from Vancouver, who is in Vancouver for reasons that she will share with us, connected with campaigning for Palestinian prisoners and facing the opposition of the German government. Friends, before we start, I trailed this discussion about the fight for justice, and our two guests will contribute mightily to that. But I wanted to share something that's particularly close to my heart, if that's okay, and it frames the conversation. I was born in '47, and at that time, I was rather vulnerable before I was adopted into a poor, very poor working class family. Mother was a cleaner, father was a miner. But before that happened, I was rather vulnerable. And at that time, the British government was scooping up poor children in Britain who were vulnerable and shipping them off to Australia, Canada, Rhodesia and New Zealand to keep those places white, or as white as they could. It was a nakedly white supremacist program that shipped many, many thousands of British children to the colonies. One, to clean up, to socially cleanse parts of British cities, and to whiten some of the colonies, to send, quote unquote, horrible phrase, good white British stock to these places. Barnardo's was involved, the Salvation Army was involved, the Catholic Church was involved, and many, many thousands of children were sent to a life of misery, physical exploitation and sexual abuse. Nobody has ever been in court. Nobody has ever done a day in prison for those crimes, which everyone listening and viewing will agree is a grotesque crime. And I think we can talk about that, Grenfell, and we could talk till the cows come home about terrible crimes committed by our elites, which never ever result in a single person doing a single hour behind bars. Let me start off with Moazzam, if I may. Moazzam, your story is a horrendous story. You were born in Birmingham. You were snatched by Pakistani intelligence and handed over to the tender mercies of the Americans. And I believe when you were detained and tortured in Bagram Air Base in Guantanamo before pressure led to your release, that the British were involved in the crimes. Have I got that right, Moazzam? And can you tell people the basics of your story?
Sure, absolutely, Nick. You have got that completely right. I'm born and raised in Birmingham. I was living in Pakistan. I was living in Afghanistan at the time of the 9/11 attacks and the ensuing invasion that happened. I was living there with my wife and kids. We evacuated to Pakistan, where I was when the CIA and the Pakistan intelligence services literally came and burst into my home in the middle of the night without any identification, put a gun to my head and carried me off, put a bag over my head. and carried me off into the back of the vehicle and took me off to these various detention camps. And of course, the whole process lasted for 3 years. It's well documented what's happened to me, but really the point, and this is important because this is essentially, I know that you got in touch with me again after I made a post about Keir Starmer in particular, and maybe want to talk about that later, but it is what I've been doing since my return from Guantanamo is being involved in whatever way possible in various process to seek redress and justice, whether that's been actually taking the Attorney General, the Foreign Office, and MI5 to court. We won an out-of-court settlement with them, but on the threat that if we didn't settle with them, that they had already employed over 60 barristers, and spent £50 million in defending what was indefensible, and that was that the incontrovertible knowledge that the British government had been completely and utterly complicit in our false imprisonment, rendition, and torture.
Let's get this right, Moazzam. They spent those millions, and most people, or many people, would have been intimidated and given up. They retreated, having spent the money, and conceded later, did they not? What kept you going? Why didn't you give up?
Because the evidence was too strong, and as I said, there were other cases, there were other individuals that had been tortured at various junctures and various points, but everything led back to MI5's role. They were physically present when they were torturing me. They were present when I saw 2 prisoners murdered. They were present when, now, and this is the shocking part, a particular individual, this is really important for all of our anybody that's listening. The CIA threatened me that if I don't cooperate, they will do to me what they did to a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. And that's really important because al-Libi was captured and then taken onto a ship, I believe, called the USS Bataan in the Persian Gulf. He was from there transferred by the Americans to Egypt under Hosni Mubarak, and in Egypt he was tortured, and he gave this confession. And this confession was that he, as a member of Al-Qaeda, which we found out that he wasn't, was working with Saddam Hussein on obtaining Western weapons of mass destruction, which he wasn't. And that was presented to Colin Powell as credible evidence, which he then presented to the United Nations Security Council in 2003, and became one of the key justifications to invade Iraq. So the people who were holding me and interrogating me and threatening me were the very ones that had done that to Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. So part of my journey since my return has been, I've got to do this. I've got to hold these people to account. There's just too much I've seen. As I said, I saw 2 people murdered with one of them with their hands tied to the top of the cage to the, above his head, being repeatedly punched and kicked until he was killed. And that's been
to death, yeah?
Yeah, beaten to death. And so these were just some of the things that I saw and witnessed. So when I came back out, I engaged in multiple processes. I gave evidence to the judge-led inquiry into allegations that the British government and its officials were involved in torture. I sat with the police, the Metropolitan Police, and gave evidence to them in the investigation that they were doing about the criminal investigation they were doing of MI5. I gave evidence to the International Criminal Court for Britain and America's role in the war crimes that I witnessed. But every single juncture that I've been involved in thus far has led to nothing. No prosecutions, no justice. And I have come to the conclusion after about 15 years of giving detailed evidence and being involved in getting others to do so, that these powers that exist, though they claim to follow the letter of the rule of the law and believe the rule of law to be a principle within British society, these guys are above the law.
So a lot of naive people, if I can put it that way, Moazzam and Charlotte, are horrified by what Israel does to the Palestinians, and they don't have any great sense of history quite often. And they're absolutely horrified and want to do something about it. So they think, well, okay, I'll lobby my MPs. I'll try and change the MPs. I'll work through the system. And, you know, the system will respond to these concerns because clearly what I've seen is terribly evil. But you think there's other blocks. There's not just what you see, there's behind, and we don't need to go into the occult, but behind the public faces of the politicians, there are defences, not just for the kids who were shipped in their thousands to whiten the colonies, but with you as well. Do you want to comment on that, Moazzam, before I bring in Charlotte to join a conversation with the three of us?
I mean, no, I've been, you know, funnily, there was a one of the prisoners with me in Guantanamo was Australian. His name was David Hicks, and he told me, you know, when I get back home, I'm gonna say something that's just funny. And I said, what are you gonna say? He said, I'm gonna say that my ancestors came here in chains, and now here I come back in chains. It was just a signature on what was going on. I mean, if you looked at the numbers of people, the people that came across there were about 800 prisoners in total at any given time. And the majority were in Guantanamo from Asia or Africa. And we were taken by the Americans in chains. Us dark-skinned people were taken by the Americans in chains across the Atlantic to the Americas. Now that has so much risk. And I'm a dark-skinned person. A large number of the prisoners were actually African Muslim prisoners, and many of the American soldiers we met were African American soldiers. And we talked to them, especially the African prisoners, and say they'd feel, how can you be part of this? And we talk to them and say to them that just look at the irony of this. And many of those soldiers were very sympathetic towards us. Some soldiers have left the military now, have come and visit me in my home and so forth. Other soldiers actually became part of the campaign against Guantanamo. They left and joined the Veterans Against the War movement and so forth. And one thing I have to say just before you pass on is that they say the kind of movement here that was against the war, as it were, didn't really do anything. The millions of people marched didn't really achieve anything. But what it achieved for me when I was sitting in solitary confinement was that I heard through sympathetic soldiers like the ones I've mentioned, that millions of people have marched against the war, a war that I didn't even know had started, the one in Iraq. And that started giving me some hope, because prior to this, the Americans were saying, nobody cares about people like you. Nobody cares about what's happening in your world, and let it burn.
No, that's fantastic. Because that pressure by the screws on the prisoners, nobody cares about you abandoned, you're on your own, you've done what you have to do, but you know, it's hopeless. Let's return to that later, because it's an absolutely central point, I hope, for this discussion. Charlotte, you recognize some of that, don't you? Because you could choose a very large number of thousands of people to talk about today, but you want to focus as an example on Salah Hamouri, is that right? And tell us a little bit about him. Charlotte, please.
Yes, I mean, I think it's really been great that we've been having this conversation, and also that we're talking about institutional racism and how that's reflected in systems of imprisonment and how that's reflected in systems of repression. And that when we talk about institutional and structural racism, that we're not simply talking about bad attitudes and prejudices and bad ideas, but about the material effects of colonization and of long-term colonialism and of imperialism and the continued plundering of people and resources around the globe to extract value for the benefit of Western imperialism that leaves the vast majority of people out. And so people look at these situations and they can say, oh, this is appalling, this is a crime, why won't it stop when we protest? And of course, the reason it won't simply stop is because it's not just a policy or a matter of a vote here and there, but a matter of, you know, really substantial economic interests in colonization and in imperialism that didn't end in the mid-20th century and that continues today. And so, you know, when we're talking about the issue of political imprisonment and repression, we're also still talking about the fight of the people against imperialism. And we also do get to see, along with that, the massive dehumanization of the majority of the globe, the people who have been the victims of and the subject of imperialism and colonialism, both from the United States, from the UK, from other European powers. And this can extend, of course, to the citizens of these countries. This can extend to the citizens of these countries. When we look at the United States, for example, and we see the massive disproportionate imprisonment of Black people across the United States, we look at Canada and we see the fact that Indigenous people are imprisoned here on their own land at a far disproportionate rate that
But that's
reflects
not
the, you know,
that
law.
the terrible violence, structural and direct towards First Nations in Canada, is barely known at all here. It's well concealed.
Yes, and we see actually those direct economic aspects as well, because so many of these, you know, recent struggles have been over, you know, creating new pipeline projects and basically extractive resource projects to extract the wealth that belongs to the indigenous people of this country without their consent and through violent repression. And so when we turn to Palestine, we turn to a settler colonial project in Palestine that's funded, you know, $3.8 billion a year by the United States, that enjoys the benefits of the EU-Israel Association Agreement to receive all kinds of support and benefits and act as a member of the EU. And we see the UK providing significant diplomatic and political and other kinds of support, arms trade with Israel. It's not really surprising. It's not just that they're violating their human rights principles, it's that these countries are siding with their imperial partner in the colonization of the region. And that can mean the absolute disregard for their own citizens, particularly their citizens of racially and nationally oppressed groups, including Palestinians. So we see this, you know, complete willingness to cast aside Palestinian and Arab and other citizens of color if they're, you know, hit with this, you know, quote unquote terror label that's used in so many cases. And of course, the Israeli regime consistently has used this term in order to try to demonize the legitimate resistance of the Palestinian people to liberate their land from occupation and oppression. But of course, this term in Israeli parlance can even apply to, you know, going to the International Criminal Court to seek prosecution for Israeli leaders. It can refer to, you know, going to court as a lawyer to represent and defend Palestinian prisoners. They refer to everyone who does this as terrorists in suits. So what we're actually seeing in the case of Salah Hamouri is, I think, an example of all of these things brought together. Salah Hamouri is a French and Palestinian man. He is a lawyer. He works for Adamir, the prisoner support and human rights organization that does, you know, great work supporting the legal interests of the families of Palestinian political prisoners that are held by the Israeli regime. And he has been repeatedly targeted for political imprisonment and detention. Most recent, he was held as a political prisoner for over 9 years, despite, you know, all of the evidence in these cases that are brought when people are brought before the military courts, or even when they're brought before allegedly civilian courts, but under a security prisoner file. All of the evidence in these cases is typically obtained through torture. There's no decent, reasonable standard of evidence in these cases. There's only the appearance of a justice system, when in fact what we're actually looking at is institutionalized injustice. After
Charlotte,
he finally
Charlotte, can I ask you to dwell on that for a moment and take us through it even slowly, because
yes,
the conviction rate for Palestinians in the West Bank is 99.7%, virtually 100%.
exactly.
That has to mean, even to the dullest individual who approaches it, that this is not a justice system. It's a meat processing system. And I think it's fair, I hope you would agree, I wonder if you'd agree, to call it just mass internment of Palestinians under the guise of them having had due process. Can you comment on that in the case of Salah Hamouri, which I think is relevant?
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at the various systems of imprisonment and oppression that Palestinians face, I mean, just when Palestinians are detained, they're taken to interrogation, and Israeli interrogation is notorious as being a center of torture and abuse. You know, 90+% of Palestinian prisoners, including child prisoners, report various forms of physical and psychological torture and abuse during the period of interrogation. And the attempt is just to,
and even sexual abuse.
yes, and I mean there are a number of cases, including historic cases such as the case of Rasmia Oda, who continues to be who after suffering horrendous physical, psychological, and sexual torture in 1969 at the hands of Israeli interrogators, continues to be pursued and persecuted and kind of followed and harassed around the world by Israel and its allied governments to the present day. In Salah's case, just like many other Palestinian prisoners, people can be either sent to the military courts for kind of this show trial in which the entire system is, it's conducted in Hebrew. Prisoners don't necessarily even fully understand what's going on. The standard of evidence is laughable and relies mostly on coerced confessions obtained from people under interrogation during, through torture and through other forms of coercion. And of course it results in this conviction rate that you're saying of 99.74%. Many people end their cases through plea agreements. And the reason why they do this is because if they don't, they are punished with a military court trial that simply never ends. And if they take the plea agreement, they could be out and back with their families before their military court trial even finishes. I mean, we look at, there's a case of a man from Gaza who has refused to take a plea agreement. And so his case has been continuing for over 3 years, and they still haven't actually gotten to the actual stage of presenting evidence in the case. And the judge has repeatedly demanded that he accept a plea agreement. So this is another way of attempting to break Palestinians' will and just kind of undermine their resistance to the system. Now, the
did
other
Salah,
path,
so I don't want to keep interrupting you, but didn't Salah get the offer of plead guilty and you'll be out in 7, plead not guilty and you're guaranteed 14? So only a maniac would plead not guilty.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. That's exactly how with his first case, why he took the plea agreement, like over 90% of Palestinians, because if you don't, there's no opportunity to sort of show that you're not guilty, especially for the vast majority of cases. Israel likes to trump up the charges, but in reality, most of the charges in these cases, including in Salah's original case, are about membership in a prohibited organization, which is the term that's used for every major Palestinian political party, or even the mass organizations like student groups, women's organizations, labor unions, etc., that work with them. So the vast majority of people are sentenced on some form of membership in providing services to a prohibited organization. It's actually very similar to the allegations that the US would also use against people in Guantanamo. These kinds of cases, if everyone has to take the plea agreement, because if they don't, they're going to be punished by a military court trial that never ever ends, and a lengthy sentence, because the entire system is run by the Israeli military. It's not a neutral and impartial system by any means. But of course, they don't have to put people in the military court system. The other thing that they do, and which they did to Salah the last time that he was imprisoned around 3 years ago, is they put people in administrative detention. And administrative detention is imprisonment without charge, without trial, for a 6-month period, but it's indefinitely renewable. So many people have spent years at a time in administrative detention without ever even facing the show trial of a military court hearing. Instead, they are just repeatedly held under administrative detention with this kind of, endless assertions under secret evidence that they're a threat to the security of the state. And even their lawyers don't have access to what that might actually mean. Now, in Salah's case, last time when he was in administrative detention, he was offered to be released early if he would accept kind of deportation to France and not come back to Palestine. Now, he, of course, did not accept this, and so it took him a long time to get out of administrative detention. On the other hand, his wife, who is French, and their son, their baby son, have been denied access to Palestine because his wife, is Salah's wife, is a supporter of BDS campaigns, is an activist for Palestine. So they've been forcibly separated by the Israeli state. And one thing that we've seen in both of these instances, the fact that he was arrested again on the 30th of June, he was planning to travel to France to spend some time with his wife and son yesterday. On the 4th of July, he had plane tickets booked. He was going to get a mandatory coronavirus test to show that he could present to say that he was free of coronavirus in order to travel on the airline. And that's when Israeli forces came in and seized him from the medical center. This is the same thing that happened the last time he was detained, when he was planning to go to France for political meetings, educational meetings, and family time. And once again, the Israelis stopped that from happening and forcibly kept their family separated by taking him and throwing him in prison for no apparent reason.
Let me bring in Moazzam again. Charlotte's describing a situation with the thinnest veneer of due process, under which it's naked colonial type violence against the inferior people, the brown-skinned people. You're operating in Britain at the moment, Moazzam. How familiar is that to you? But the veneer of due process, actually, it can be real due process in certain situations. I've been in court and actually won many times. You can't do that if you're a Palestinian. But how familiar is that picture that Charlotte's describing to you, Moazzam?
It's deeply familiar. It's familiar from two aspects. One is, of course, from Britain, where I am, where there is anti-terror legislation passed, and there have been people placed under administrative detention, even in the UK, in emergency legislation that happened in 2001. 16 North African and Middle Eastern men were detained without charge or trial for 3 years here in the UK, and then were eventually released, only to be placed on control orders, which were based upon secret evidence, and they were essentially placed under house arrest. That's kind of the backdrop of what was.
Can you explain that further, Moazzam? I'll tell you why, because we know that immigrants and asylum seekers are violated in an extreme way, right, and locked up for a long time. But you're saying this happens to British citizens as well?
Well, that particular one was happening to asylum seekers. With British citizens is a bit different, but if you look at the level of anti-terror legislation that's been passed throughout the past 20 years, and almost every year there's a new law. It has, in de facto terms, almost exclusively affected people from the Muslim community, whether it's glorification of terrorism, whether it's control orders, whether it's this most latest one, the Counterterrorism and Border Security Act, where you could be deemed to be a terrorist, not because of membership of an organization or because of something you've done or somebody you've supported. It's just because you happen to be in a place that could be designated a terrorist region. So the gamut of laws and measures that exist in this country against what is perceived to be Muslim terrorism are far greater than what we've had at any point in our history, including the 40 years of the Troubles. But in relation to, I just wanted to mention, because Charlotte mentions about some of the things that resonated with me about what's happening to the Palestinians. And of course, the majority of the prisoners in Guantanamo were from the Arab and Muslim world. And they used whatever leverage they could to kind of break the resolve of the prisoners. So one famous prisoner, Mahmoud al-Qahtani, it's recorded, and he reported and told the prisoners that they wrapped me in an Israeli flag to try and break my resolve, to try to somehow make me feel less than human and completely subdued. But probably the most important case right now in Guantanamo is that of a Palestinian, and his name is Abu Zubaydah Zain al-Abidin. And Abu Zubaydah has been in Guantanamo for almost now for 2 decades without charge. And Abu Zubaydah is the one that in the beginning, there were all sorts of rumors placed out by the CIA and the FBI and the US Department of Defense that he's Al-Qaeda's, Osama bin Laden's strategist, then he's his right-hand man, then he's perhaps the 22nd hijacker. There was all this stuff that was placed out. Now, as of 2009, they've dropped all of that. And despite the really low level of low standards of evidentiary proof required to charge a person with a crime in Guantanamo, you can charge him with anything if you want to, he's not been charged with a crime. And yet—
So 20 years and no charges at the moment.
It gets far worse. It gets much worse. You may have seen a film called The Report. If you haven't, it's on Amazon Prime at the moment, and it's about the Senator Dianne Feinstein, and how her office and department were investigating the role of psychiatrists and the CIA in the Senate, in the torture program, in the CIA torture program. It goes all the way back to Gina Haspel herself, who was at that time working in a place called the Cat's Eye Prison. And later, of course, you know, she became many years later, became the head of the CIA. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded over 83 times. The entire enhanced interrogation techniques program that was signed off by the most powerful legal people in the United States of America, like Alberto Gonzalez, Jay Bybee, and all of these others. They essentially said that if it isn't organ failure or death, then it's not torture. And that's what allowed them to waterboard Abu Zubaydah in Thailand, and then guess where else in Europe? In Lithuania, in Poland, and in Romania. Unbelievably, Abu Zubaydah, through European court hearings and rulings, has been compensated and recognized as a victim of torture by these nations, and they have been forced to pay him compensation, even as he's in Guantanamo, being held without charge or trial. And as I said, the entire torture program was made for Abu Zubaydah, but then it was passed out or carried out against other people. And the process of waterboarding, which is supposed to be kind of the lightest method of torture, is when a person is strapped down to a gurney, their hands, their legs, and their head are tied back down together. A cloth is pushed into the mouth and water is poured into the nose, so you get the feeling, the sense of that you're drowning. That was done to him over 83 times. And it has then, of course, been done to many, many others. That's just one of the techniques. And recently, earlier this year, the New York Times published a series of self-portraits Abu Zubaydah did, and you can see them if you do a search, of all the different torture techniques, because waterboarding is simply just one of them. There's so many others. Some of those I endured myself, like short shackling, like walling, like sleep deprivation. But Abu Zubaydah's ones, if you look at them, he's actually, one of them, he's tied in a box, I mean, like a coffin. And there's some holes that are drilled for him to breathe out of, but he's left in there like a living dead man. So these are the sort of types of techniques that were being employed in the US torture program. And the fact that Abu Zubaydah is a Palestinian, to me, is important, because why do they take Abu Zubaydah in the first place? Why is Abu Zubaydah in Afghanistan? Why is he connected to a struggle? What does he want to do? He, in his way, in his world, all he wants to do is to find a way to help to liberate his own people. That's what he said. If you see in the writings, is that's why he's even involved in that world there. So the point is... Can
I bring this round? Sorry, if you want to finish.
Yeah, so the point is that the United States develops this torture program, which now Hollywood is making films about how bad it is and how good the people that uncovered the torture program are, and did an exercise in openness. Yet Abu Zubaydah remains in a detention camp without charge or trial. And even I've been trying to work on the possibility of which countries might be able to take him, because there's a problem upon a problem. The compounded problem is that he's actually stateless, is effectively stateless. So where do you find a home for somebody like that? And the major reason why they're not releasing him isn't because they have any evidence that he committed a crime. The major reason is because imagine what he would say when he comes out to the world.
Exactly. Moazzam talked about the complicity of the medical profession, psychiatrists and others. I'm sure, Charlotte, you know about the complicity of Israeli doctors. That, in fact, shockingly, the head of the Israeli Medical Association was elected, I don't know for how long, as head of the International Medical Association. And there were hundreds and hundreds of doctors worldwide complained because of the professional involvement in Israel in torture. Charlotte, do you want to comment on that? And can we talk about, by the way, feel free to politely interrupt each other. Can we talk about the general complicity in what's going on in Palestine and the complicity in your abuse, Moazzam, such that when we identify it, many of us might be able to find levers to pull here, because we're talking about how do you fight for justice in a system that manifestly protects the unjust. Charlotte, please come in.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at, for example, one of the primary mechanisms which prisoners around the world use to struggle when they're behind bars, when they don't have any weapons or mechanisms of really communicating freely with the world that they can struggle with, is with their own bodies, and that's through hunger strikes. And of course, there were many, many hunger strikes in Guantanamo, and there is a long, long history of hunger strikes within Israeli jails conducted by Palestinian prisoners, just as we can see the history of hunger strikes conducted by Irish prisoners and many other political prisoners around the world. These hunger strikes have been met on various occasions with either force feeding, attempts at force feeding, forced injection of glucose and other kinds of sustaining liquids in order to basically undermine and stop the hunger strike from happening in a physical way. And in terms of, you know, force feeding historically in Palestine, several Palestinian prisoners were actually killed in the past due to force feeding, due to the effects of force feeding and how damaging and dangerous it actually is to force feed a hunger striker. We see this happening. We see that there's this, you know, consistent involvement of the medical profession, not in standing up to, not in looking at Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian sick patients as people who are, you know, who have rights to treatment, but instead just being complicit in an entire system that essentially repeatedly delays and denies healthcare for Palestinian prisoners who are sick and ill, provides only painkillers in many cases, despite the fact that people have much more serious illnesses, refuse to provide necessary testing. And so we've seen in multiple cases where Palestinian prisoners are later diagnosed with cancer, that their cancer could have been detected many, many years before, much earlier on, much before the disease became more serious, if their repeated complaints about their need for medical assistance had been met with just proper testing instead of what's actually happened, which is the systematic denial of healthcare to Palestinian prisoners. And of course, there are hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who are serving decades behind bars. And so what this means is that, you know, there are Palestinian prisoners who are over 80 years old. And so these are people who absolutely desperately need medical care and health care.
Have I got it right, Charlotte? The grim record is 34 years. Mandela did 22, but I think it's in the mid-30s, isn't it?
It's up to around 40 years for people like I mean it's up to above around 40 years for people like Karim Yunus, for people like Nail Barouti, who was actually released for a few years. He was released. He was one of the prisoners who was released in the Wafa al-Ahrar prisoner exchange, and he got married to another former prisoner, a woman who was also a former prisoner, and then they came and they rearrested him. And these prisoners that were released as part of the earlier prisoner exchange with the Palestinian resistance are essentially being held as hostages in an attempt to you know, gain the release of the remains of Israeli soldiers without making any real concessions to the Palestinian resistance. And so we have these, you know, people who have spent their entire adult lives behind Israeli bars and are systematically denied meaningful health care. And I should note in this context that it does not matter whether the people involved are nominally Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens in 1948. Once you have that classification of being a security prisoner, which is really just an Israeli term for being a political prisoner. This is a term that's used pretty much just for Palestinians. It's used as for what they describe as, you know, crimes of a nationalist character.
Charlotte, those Jewish terrorists who burned the Dawabsha family, and when the family went to when the family went to court, they were outside the court chanting about Ali, Ali, Ali's on the grill. I believe they complained because Shin Bet had tortured them. And they said, you don't torture Jews, that's just for Palestinians. That was public. Could I ask you both to share your opinions on the dehumanization of Palestinians? Chomsky quotes an Israeli cabinet member who heard Ariel Sharon say in cabinet, the only good Arab is a dead Arab. Palestinians are dehumanized. How did you feel dehumanized, Moazzam? Can you share experiences of this? It's pretty macabre and horrible, but let's do it. People need to know what's going on.
You know, the thing is, you know, my connection to this is that when I was picked up from my house in the middle of the night by the CIA and taken off into the middle of the night for the next 3 years, I left behind a Palestinian wife and my children. You know, so I've always understood what's happened through the lens of that experience, of that connection. Her family left in 48 and became refugees in their homelands, they still hold on to the documents of the orchards that they believe one day somehow that they'll return to in Haifa and other places. But you know, just when Charlotte was talking about the whole issue of the role of the medical profession, it's really important because, you know, obviously they take the Hippocratic Oath that they will do no harm to anyone and treat everyone equally. There was an occasion in Guantanamo when I'd been in my solitary confinement cell, which is about 8 foot by 6 foot. There's no window. There's no access to any other prisoners. I'd had no phone calls, no charges, no lawyers, no television, no radio, no newspapers, nothing. You're just completely at the hands of the interrogators and the soldiers. Some of whom were decent. The interrogators had a completely different role. One day I lost it. I was pacing up. You can only pace 3 steps forward, 3 steps backward, and you're like in a cage, like an animal. And I started to cry and scream and punch and kick. And then they sent in a psychiatrist. Now this psychiatrist was in military uniform, and she sat down and sat across me on the other side. And she said, 558, that was my number. Have you ever considered taking your trousers off, threading them with your sheet, tying that around your neck in a noose, and then tying it to the top of the cage in the corner and jumping? Have you ever considered doing that? And I thought, oh my goodness, this woman's trying, I don't know what she's trying to play at, but I said, no, I've not ever thought of that and the thought never even crossed my mind. And that was it. She came, she said her piece, and she left. When I was released from Guantanamo in 2005, a few months later, it was reported that 3 prisoners were found in their cells, hanged, dead. And the Americans have always said that they did it themselves, that it was, they actually called it asymmetrical warfare. They said they're doing this in order to get a bad press on Guantanamo, as if Guantanamo did had a good press to begin with. And that's how they labeled it. But the shocking thing about all of this is the role of psychiatrists, psychologists, the medical profession. I remember very clearly, it had been the case for a long time, that your medical treatment was dependent upon your cooperation. So if you cooperated, you'd get your medical treatment. If not, as Charlotte was saying, the most they'd give you is, in America, it's paracetamol here, but in America, I think they use something called Motrin. So they say, yeah, give him Motrin. If he's got whatever ailment, serious ailment or otherwise, just give him some Motrin, he'll be fine. And that was, of course, over a period of time of 20 years or so or more, it changes people. It forces people. So the person who's the victim, even if he then is forced to seek refuge, as it were, with his oppressor, you can't blame him. And that's what they want to do, to make you reliant upon them. That, you know, they'll bring an interrogator and say, we'll make your life easy if you do X, Y, Z, which is to betray your comrades and people that are with you, and bring great suspicion upon yourself, and also betray whatever it is that you thought that your relationship was with these people, because they oppressed you, they tortured you, they beat you, in some cases they killed some people. But now, if you work with us, you'll be okay. And if that's what it's like inside a prison compound like Guantanamo, I can only imagine in Palestine the effects of that, and how destructive, deeply destructive, it has been to society.
Well, we can jump from there, Moazzam, straight to Palestine and Charlotte. I know people who receive phone calls in Gaza to become collaborators, and then their mother might get an operation. Charlotte, can you talk about the pressure and the carrot and the stick, the ugly stick and the horrible carrot that's used to produce collaborators?
Sure. I mean, in one of the most common kind of situations is actually the one that you just referenced, particularly in Gaza. Not that it's necessarily effective, but it is a mechanism that the Israelis consistently use as an attempt to try to basically hold family members' lives and necessity for treatment hostage. Because what you have in Gaza is you have an area of Palestine that the Israelis, that on the one hand, the land is liberated from the Israelis, the Palestinian resistance can operate, Palestinians can organize, right? But at the same time, this area is subjected to an immense heavy siege that has caused devastating poverty. Fishers can't fish, farmers can't farm because they're shot by the Israelis. And if fishers take their boats out to fish on their own Gaza Sea, they face the fact that they could maybe not come home, or their knees could be shot out, or their boats could be taken away and destroyed. Palestinians can't have the sort of natural relationship that they should be able to have with Egypt, where there should be openness and freedom of travel between Palestine and Egypt, as there was for millennia before the Israeli occupation. This has been, the Egyptian government instead is complicit in Israel's siege on Gaza and continues the lockdown. And so, when you had a situation where there was a bit of an opening in Egypt, when there was a bit of ability, even the siege never ended, but there was still a little bit of ability for there to be commerce and trade and normal travel, you had actually the improvement of Palestinian life in Gaza. And this sparked intense anger in the United States and Israel, and did absolutely contribute to their support for the military coup in Egypt and for the intensification of the siege on Gaza. So you have this situation where, because of the siege, because of Israel's siege, which is fully backed by the European Union, by the United States, by Canada, even when people issue statements of concern about the situation of Palestinians in Gaza, these countries do nothing that could actually put pressure on Israel to end its siege. Instead, they're fully complicit with the policies and demand that Palestinians must change their leadership and destroy their resistance if they want to have normal ability to receive food and medical care and things like this. And so because of that, the hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza, despite the fact that there are a tremendous number of doctors, of professionals, don't have access to the medicines, the equipment, the technology that's necessary to provide advanced treatment for diseases like cancer, heart disease, and other illnesses. So when Palestinians want to travel, even just to go to Egypt or to go to the West Bank to receive cancer treatment or other kinds of advanced medical care, what happens is they have to apply to the Israelis for a permit. And so this becomes this system whereby sometimes people are given permits, and then when they show up at Erez Crossing with their family member, they're arrested. And sometimes this is just an attempt to force people to collaborate by holding their elderly mother and father's lives on the line and essentially saying, if you give us information about the Palestinian resistance, if you inform on your people, then and only then will your family members be able to receive life-saving and necessary treatment. And so we've seen this attempt in numerous cases. And of course, most people resist it. The vast majority of Palestinians resist it, but they never stop trying. And so we see the same kinds of things where there's always this attempt to kind of put people in an impossible personal situation in an attempt to extract collaboration with Israel as a result, an attempt to break the will and the social unity of the Palestinian people. Now, unfortunately, in the West Bank, we have the problem of the Palestinian Authority, which isn't collaboration in the sense that we're talking about here, but has an institutionalized security coordination with Israel, even when the PA issues statements to say, oh, we're going to cut off coordination with Israel. The reality is that security coordination continues on a daily basis, supported by the United States, despite everything that's happening in the media. Supported by the United States, supported by this kind of training and funding and technology. And so what happens is that there's this institutionalized system that is based on providing security cooperation with the occupation. And this in many ways has made it much easier for the occupation, because instead of having to do these kind of one-on-one attempting to just break people's will, they have an institutionalized system that they can turn to get cooperation when it comes to repressing the Palestinian resistance. This is very dangerous for the Palestinians.
Moazzam, you have to talk about Sir Keir Starmer. We have a prime minister who's a passionate Zionist, quote unquote. Britain sells sniper rifle parts to the Israeli military, even when the UNHCR says they're deliberately killing children. Trauma surgeons who wanted to come to Britain to take part in a conference from Gaza, where they are absolute experts, were barred, were refused a visa by the British government to come to a trauma surgeons conference. When the UNHCR fines against Israel, the British government condemned the UNHCR and vowed it would not support any criticisms of Israel. Now, your personal story, Moazzam, is one of abuse and torture involving British salaried officials. What can we do about it? Let's, if you would make, concluding remarks, take your time, but let's move on to what we're asking people to do, because it's pathological to know what's happening and not do anything. Absolutely. Do you want to talk about Sir Keir, his role, and what we can do about it?
So one of the things that I spoke of, and as I said, when I came back from Guantanamo, of course, there are lots of campaigning, lots of lectures, lots of raising awareness, but also crucially being involved in various legal processes to bring the British government and the Americans to account. Now, as I said, every single time I've tried, there has been a block. Every time people have said that, yeah, we're very, very serious about getting justice. I've even met government ministers from both sides of the divide, because the whole Guantanamo and Britain's role in torture was so toxic that they wanted it to go away. But it can't go away because there's been no justice. And one of the things that happened is that when we submitted so much evidence and sat with the police, gave them the full descriptions of the MI5 agents that were physically there, we gave them the full background and the backdrop, and they, as it were investigating. The British police officers were going over to America, to Guantanamo, to Libya, and interviewing prisoners. So they were serious about the case, at least. But whatever it was, Sir Keir Starmer, who was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, simply, when it came to that evidence, and there was a massive amount of evidence, he refused to issue any prosecutions. Now, that says to me, bearing in mind some of the stuff we've heard about him now recently, about sacking Rebecca Long Bailey and so forth, simply for tweeting something that criticizes the Israeli government here as anti-Semitism, and then rounding that off by saying that I'm making this very clear. We will not tolerate this at all. And if you add to that what you've said about Britain's role in attacking the United Nations for criticizing Israel, it's very clear to me the system of justice here is deeply corrupt at this level. And Britain is a country that's known, Britain, America, Canada, are all countries that pride themselves on concepts like Magna Carta, habeas corpus, and so forth. But here you have countries deeply involved, or defending countries that are deeply involved in the removal of those basic rights, the right to the body, in the implementation of things like administrative detention, which are abhorrent to British values. One of the British values is supposed to be the rule of law. Well, the rule of law says that you can't detain a person without charge or trial. So when you've got somebody like the Director of Public Prosecution, or former Director of Public Prosecutions, and now the head of Her Majesty's most loyal opposition, being the person that does this, you lose total confidence completely in the system, in seeking justice, because of who he was and who he is now. I put a great deal of weight in people power. My own organization, Cage, has been campaigning against anti-terror legislation for the past 15 years. We're calling for a complete repeal. I've been to Northern Ireland more times than I can remember, and it wasn't anti-terror legislation there that solved the problem. It made the problem worse. Internment made the problem worse. Every time there's an issue that happens here that connects Muslims to acts of terrorism, there are senior people saying, we need to bring back internment, as if, did you learn nothing? Bloody Sunday happened because of internment, and because of Bloody Sunday, the rise of the IRA happened, and which almost broke, tore the whole nations apart. So we've been asking for this, and we continue to do so. At the moment, they've got laws like Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, whereby 88%, according to a Cambridge University study, says 88% of the people stopped under Schedule 7 are Muslims. We're only 4% of the population. And Schedule 7, you can be held up for up to, before it was 9 hours, now it's 6. And you can be questioned, detained, have your DNA taken, photographed, strip searched, and all your documents taken and seized. And if you refuse to answer any questions, you can be arrested and convicted as a terrorist, even though you're not involved in any violence or anything. So that's how British laws apply on us as we speak.
What are you asking? What are you asking people to do?
So we're asking people to join us in the call to repeal these laws. We've got to actually repeal the bulk of anti-terror legislation that's been passed in this country for the past 15 odd years, because all it has done, if anything, you could say, well, where's the proof? Why do you keep saying that we're more, the situation now is more tenuous than it's ever been? That means your laws have failed, and they failed because they've targeted people based upon ethnicity and based upon your perceived religion. So we're calling people to join us in, join our petition to stop Schedule 7, to repeal Schedule 7, and indeed to all of the other laws. If you look at them and break them down, they really haven't, the Glorification of Terrorism Act, that's another one. What does that mean? Glorifying terrorism. That we had somebody called Samina Malik, who in 2008 was convicted, and one of the evidences against her was that she wrote poetry in the land of Shakespeare.
Well, that's the connection between Britain and Israel then, isn't it? Where poets are jailed.
Exactly, exactly. So our point is that we do ask people, come join, be involved in the work of Cage. Look at what we're doing. We try to empower our own community, because one of the things Charlotte recognizes is that when the state is pressing you so hard, it's very hard to hold your head up. It's very hard to hold your head up and to say, I stand for my people. And what we've seen here is that there's been attempts to co-opt Muslim organizations and individuals and to pressurize them, sometimes through something as whether it's on as a street level, people who've got relatives who are asylum seekers. MI5 will come along to them and say, you know, we can make your life easier, or we can make it harder for them through your relatives. Yeah. We have had a massive number of people approached by MI5. Cage has an entire workshop we give to people about what your rights are when MI5 comes knocking on the door. So there is a mass amount of work that we need to do just here in the UK, just to defend ourselves. But linking it to international, and one of the things that happens, of course, I know I've sat with a young man, 17 years old. The reason why he was referred to Prevent, to the anti-terrorism police, was because he campaigned on campus against the abuses in Palestine by the Israeli occupation forces. And so they do, one of the questions they have, police officers and Prevent officers, is, what is your view on Palestine? Because that will determine whether you are or not deemed an extremist. Right. So again, we ask people to get involved with us, join us, because we want Prevent to be scrapped. It is not worth the paper it's written on, and it has done more damage than any good.
Thanks, Moazzam. You're absolutely right. The whole struggle against Prevent, the way in which people are stigmatized by the authorities, Palestine is sometimes used as the litmus test. How you answer the question of Palestine means you're on one side or the other in terms of how far the state's concerned. Charlotte, so much we could talk about. I'd like to make a few announcements at the end, but if you would please tell people what you're asking them to do. What can they do in support of Salah Hamouri and in Palestinian prisoners in general who are brutally abused by the Israeli regime? Please, Charlotte, I'll give you the last word if that's okay.
Okay, thank you so much. So first, in terms of Salah's case, I am the international coordinator of an organization and network called Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. We organize in countries around the world to support the Palestinian struggle for liberation and build solidarity, particularly with Palestinian political prisoners who represent the imprisoned Palestinian leadership that are being denied to the Palestinian struggle and to the Palestinian people who continue to resist and refuse to have their will and spirit broken despite over 72 years of colonization and dispossession. So I want to encourage people to visit our website at samidoun.net, SAMIDOUN.net, to get news, information, and action alerts about the prisoners. In the case of Salah Hamouri, I think it's very urgent to follow the lead of Salah's family and urge people to contact French diplomatic officials. We've seen time and time again the French state refuse to take Salah's detention seriously, refuse to act seriously to stop the violation of their citizens' human rights. And so the larger and stronger the campaign is to demand that they take action, the more pressure there is to try to compel them to do so. So this is one thing that's very important in Salah's case. We will have that information on our site, and there's also a French campaign for Salah, which you can follow to get even more information directly from his family. In terms of all Palestinian prisoners, because the struggle to free Salah is part of the struggle to free 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, and it's part of the struggle to free the entire Palestinian people in Palestinian land from colonization, occupation, and oppression. One thing that people can do around the world is get involved in campaigns for boycotts, for divestments, for sanctions, to demand a military embargo on Israel, to demand the international isolation of Israel and the boycott not only of Israeli goods and products, but also of those multinational corporations that are daily profiting off of the benefits and the funds that they receive for selling services and weapons and product to the Israeli army, to the Israeli institutions that are absolutely complicit. Not just the military itself, but the Israeli state and all of its institutions are fully complicit in the crimes being committed against the Palestinian people. And so this is also something that we encourage people to do. We fully agree with all of the campaigns to end terror laws. What we see is that bogus terrorism laws, bogus anti-terror laws are used as a weapon to club the Palestinian community in exile. You have Palestinians are actually majority refugees, including those who are in exile and diaspora around the world. And these kinds of laws are used to suppress Palestinian communities' own involvement in their liberation struggle, as well as the solidarity movement. So fighting against these kinds of laws in our own countries is also something that we can do to help oppose the imprisonment of Palestinians everywhere. I mean, look at France. There's the case of George Abdallah, who's been a political prisoner in France for 35 years. So that's another campaign that we can take on with France, along with Salah Hamouri, that France take action to free Salah inside occupied Palestine, but also free George Abdallah after 35 years of detention. And finally, we want to say that getting involved in social justice movements in our own countries and communities is also critical, whether that's the movement for Black lives and the movement for Black liberation, whether that is fighting against various forms of repression, whether that's fighting for justice for working people, for women, for movements fighting colonialism and imperialism everywhere, fighting against the new wars and new threats. All of this, every victory that we achieve for justice in the world, every victory that we achieve against racism, colonialism, and imperialism and Zionism, every one of those victories is a victory for Palestine. And in the same way, every Palestinian prisoner that is freed, every victory that Palestinians achieve is also a victory for our movements for justice and liberation around the world. And so all of this is also a struggle for Palestine as well. Thank you again for inviting me today to be part of this discussion. It's been an honor to speak with both of you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to have to have you in from Vancouver and Moazzam in from exotic Birmingham, way south of here. A real pleasure. And I know. Look, you heard Moazzam say that banged up inside the dungeons in Guantanamo, the events in the outside world can make a difference. And in a struggle, morale is critical. And if you're made to feel isolated and alone and abandoned, the opposition is winning. On the contrary, if we can build a solidarity campaign with all the people who are jailed, as Moazzam was jailed, as the Palestinians are jailed by the thousand, then we send a message to them and we can raise their morale. Really, I keep returning to this all the time, but I'm not a Muslim. Muslims go to Mecca. I'm not a Catholic, they go to Lourdes, but I would go to Dunn's stores in Dublin and get down on my knees to the women and men there who went on strike because they refused to handle South African goods. And when they refused to handle the goods, their boss said, you have to handle it or you're out on the street. They were on the street for many, many, many months. And you know, in South Africa, in Robben Island even, when people heard that there was a strike by these trade unionists in Dublin in support of the liberation struggle in South Africa, it actually changed the balance between the screws and the prisoners inside the jails, because the people who were being smashed, and their military wing was being smashed as well at that time. It was a fantastic support for them to know that in faraway Ireland, people were prepared to move and make sacrifices on their behalf. And we have to do the same. That's got to be the playbook that we play with to the people in the dungeons of Guantanamo and the huge dungeons of Israel. I just want to share one thing with you, if I may. This is my humble little home. It's just a miner's cottage. But there were two cops in here this morning in this room. They came and knocked on the door because yesterday I put in a complaint. Let me show you something. I just need to share my screen. Can people see that? No? Share. No. Can anyone see what I'm looking at here? It's a page from Glasgow Friends of Israel. And in the past, they have posted about euthanizing Palestinians. In the past, they have hosted a conversation about welcoming the massacre of Muslims in the mosque in New Zealand last year. It's payback, they said, for what Muslims have done. And look at this. This creature is writing about a young Muslim woman who, actually, I won't show her face, but it's a young Muslim woman they're trying to get fired from her job. And the photograph's on the string. And then this guy says, she should be strangled with her headscarf. She should be strangled with her headscarf, says this guy. And I can click on his name and I come to his Facebook page. I reported it as a hate crime to Police Scotland, and they're not going to prosecute it as a hate crime. Now, God forbid, if I were to say Jewish people should be strangled with their religious regalia, it'd be a disgusting thing and I would deserve all I got. But I would be punished for sure, and it would be news in the newspapers. But if a young Muslim woman in a public platform, it's said of her, she should be strangled with her own scarf, Police Scotland won't even prosecute it as a hate crime. They will register it as a hate incident, which is a different category. But we'll push for this to be taken seriously. But friends, it's not a level playing field. The only thing we have at the end of the day is our solidarity. They have power, they have lots of money, they have friends in high places. Keir Starmer, a passionate Zionist, Jeremy Corbyn, Johnson, the creature, and Home Secretary Patel, who wanted to redirect British humanitarian aid to the Israeli army some time ago. So that's what we're up against. It's really, really, when we listen to Moazzam and we listen to Charlotte, we know we're up against a mighty, merciless power, and we have to fight. We've no choice. And the only thing we have is our solidarity. Final words, Moazzam, before I leave.
This is the litmus test. I think this is the litmus test. If you want to see where somebody stands, you've got to see where they stand on Palestine. Yeah. That really is. I mean, I haven't had much to do with the Palestinian campaigning against Israel and so forth.
Well, we'll change that because we'll cooperate with you on one of your workshops. Yeah,
absolutely. But as I said again, if you want to know where somebody stands, you can see exactly. Priti Patel, you can see her why she's Islamophobic, but her position on Palestine is very clear, is that it's anti-Palestinian. You can look at Boris Johnson, Islamophobic, very strong supporter of Zionism. Keir Starmer, he may be a little more to the left, but when it comes to the...
No, he's not. He's the only member of the British Parliament, the only one who is a member of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was set up by Rockefeller. It's got the leading lights of the military and intelligence community in America, and the only man they have in the British Parliament is Keir Starmer. He's one of them. He's not intimidated by them. He's one of them, and that's why he acts the way he does.
And so you can see that sort of, but at least it's clear to most of us. If anybody had any doubts, I think again this became a test that it was on the issue of Zionism and Israel, where Keir Starmer showed everybody else where his bread is buttered, as it says.
You're right. It's a litmus test. Friends, I'm going to end now. Seeing Moazzam talking about watching people beaten to death, himself being tortured, Charlotte talking about the torture visited upon people in Palestine, the Palestinian people as a whole. It seems rather perverse to talk about what happened to me, but it's instructive as well. I spent 5 years in court charged with racism. One, saying the words "end the siege of Gaza" was racist in the eyes of the Scottish prosecutors. Two, talking about the blood of Palestinians spilled in Operation Protective Edge was turned into a blood libel against Jews. I was also charged with assault. It was thrown out when we produced footage. And I've also been charged with driving too slowly. I know it's ridiculous, but look, it's when you stand up for Palestinians, when you stand up against injustice, they come for you here. The price is ridiculously low compared to colonial peoples having to struggle for their freedom. They come up against naked. But we have no choice. We have to fight. Friends, there's a trial on in Berlin in August the 3rd. Comrades are on trial there where it's really hard for challenging an Israeli diplomat who came to Berlin to justify the mass murder of Palestinians. I hope to be there. I hope our campaign will make a donation to the Defence Fund, but I urge people to attend in Berlin on Monday, the 3rd of August. There will be solidarity accommodation on the Sunday night for those who are prepared to turn up and support those comrades there. Friends, it's a real pleasure, Moazzam Begg. It's a real pleasure, Charlotte Cates. I hope we'll see you again on our little program sometime in the future. But in the meantime, solidarity. And
thank you so much.
We hang together or we hang separately. Thanks for viewing, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Vancouver. Bye, Birmingham.